skill and determination to succeed made him a player that any team could win with. Sir Alex Ferguson, the greatest manager of all time, once said, "Give me Zidane and 10 pieces of wood, and I'll win you the Champions League." There is also a rumour that he was never caught offside in his entire career, but this isn't true. Still, it gives you an idea of just how good he was. He is one of only 8 players to have won the Ballon d'Or, UEFA Champions League, and most impressively of all, the World Cup. France won their first ever World Cup at home in Saint-Denis, defeating a Brazil side which appeared in 3 consecutive World Cup finals 3-0, with Zidane scoring 2 of those goals. The 1998 World Cup was the first time France ever won the World Cup, considered long overdue given the volume of talent the French team had produced over the years. 1998 was also a significant year for Japanese video game titan Sega, one of the 3 big console makers. They were about to launch a console that years later Zidane's teammates Emmanuel Petit, Thierry Henry, Patrick Vieira and Robert Pires would all end up advertising. The Sega Dreamcast. Unbeknownst to any of them though, and to most people, the Dreamcast carried with it the last hope of the Sega Corporation. Its success was vital. First off, Sega was in a pretty bad situation in 1998. Years of mismanagement had crippled the company in more ways than one. Following the success of the Mega Drive launched in 1988, Sega launched the Mega CD in 1991, then both the 32X and Saturn in 1994. While the 32X and the Mega CD were both add-ons for the Mega Drive, they functioned ostensibly as their own consoles but sold poorly. Sega infamously botched their launch of the Saturn by launching the console several months early without telling anyone that they were going to do it. A major problem was the lack of willingness to stick to a plan on behalf of Sega. This was especially prevalent for the Saturn launch, where a large part of the reason was the belief of Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama that the console had to be put out ahead of the upcoming Sony PlayStation in order to gain a vital edge. Did it work? Well, the Saturn sold 9.2 million units worldwide. The PlayStation? 102.4 million units. Worse still was the success of the N64, which sold 32.9 million units. This left Sega very firmly in 3rd place. For the fiscal year ending on the 31st of March 1998, Sega posted a net loss of $269.8 million. From controlling a high of 65% of the market share in 1992, Sega controlled just 12% of the market in 1997, compared to Nintendo's 40% and Sony's 47%. But numbers can change. What was harder to change was sentiment, and sentiment towards Sega was extremely negative following the series of botched consoles. Obviously consumers are pissed off by this because it meant that if you bought a Sega system there was a good chance that you were buying a system that was going to be discontinued within 2 years. Why would you buy one of those when you could buy a SNES, N64 or PS1, which was guaranteed to be supported, as well as with quality games? Not every Sega console had a lot of those. For every good reason to own a Saturn, there were 10 more to support owning one of its competitors. But an often undiscussed consequence is that third-party developers began to resent Sega. Their bottom lines were being seriously affected by spending a large sum of money to release games for Sega systems, then not seeing a substantial return on that investment because Sega had decided yet again to pull the plug. No blow was more damaging than the blow dealt to Sega by EA though. EA's sports titles were still respected at this point, and Sega championed themselves as the best place to play sports games on. EA announced shortly before the launch of the system that they would not be developing any games for the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was seeming more and more like a car crash waiting to happen by the second. I wanted to interject with this. This is a bit, I think it would be better for me to explain rather without the script. Sega, for them to be doing this is like a very risky, it's really hard to overstate how risky this was at the time for them to do. Part of the reason is because it's something not very understood about console manufacturing is that it's really a boom or bust thing. You can't have a moderate success because a moderate success is just as good as a failure. If your console isn't selling more than 10 million units worldwide, it's really it's probably not going to be worth it in the long run. Now, the Dreamcast, it was a bit of a more unique specimen in that regard. It didn't quite have to sell that many to be a success, but there's still a lot of cost involved between R&D and marketing and the cost of producing a system. There's really so much that goes into it, and it's part of the reason why we don't see too many console manufacturers anymore, because even as the market gets kind of more closed in, it's really, really hard and often not worth the risk to try and make a console. So bear that in mind as we're heading forward. Development began as early as 1995, working with the likes of the 3DO company and Matsuhita. Sega were working on a graphics card for a Saturn II, a 64-bit add-on for the Saturn. But of course, we know what happened to the Saturn. In 1997, work began on a dedicated console, going in a much different direction to its predecessor. Sega focused on using cheap, off-the-shelf components which helped keep the price of the system down. To this day, the Dreamcast is the second cheapest video game console at launch, only to the GameCube. This also contributed to the Dreamcast being far easier to develop for than the Saturn. Without getting too technical, the Dreamcast was the first 128-bit system ever, also being the first to come with a built-in modem, which many of the higher-ups at Sega disapproved of. However, Isao Okawa, majority shareholder in Sega, ultimately approved the idea. Furthermore, Sega worked in conjunction with Microsoft to develop a version of Windows which was compatible with the Dreamcast's hardware. This offered developers the tools to port games from the PC to the Dreamcast with ease, although many still opted to use Sega's tools, perhaps a testament to how easy the system was to develop for. Sega used GDs as the preferred media storage, not quite CDs, not quite DVDs. The reason for this was because the GDs could hold 1 GB of data, quite a lot for the time. CDs could only hold 650 MB by comparison. The CPU the Dreamcast ended up using was the Hitachi SH4, which had a processing speed of 200 MHz, but this wasn't the initial choice of Sega, who preferred instead to go with the Motorola Power PC603E. But 3DFX, who were making the graphics processors for the system, were dropped in favour of NEC and their PowerVR graphics processor. In 1997, 3DFX had their IPO, or initial public offering. Basically, 3DFX was listed on the stock market for the first time and due to legal obligations, revealed that they were working on Sega's new console. This didn't go down well with Sega, who immediately cut off ties with 3DFX and went to NEC instead. There is still debate as to whether or not Sega made the right call, with many stating that the Motorola/3DFX architecture was better, but as stated by Executive Vice President of Sega of America at the time, Bernie Stolar, Sega's relationship with NEC, a Japanese company, probably made a difference too. Aside from that, the design of the console never really changed much from concept to finished product. For reasons I don't understand, the iconic swirl is different in Europe than it is in the rest of the world. Personally, I prefer the European swirl because blue is the colour of Sega, it only makes sense. But perhaps this was an intentional decision to make something that didn't look like a Sega console. Remember, Sega's reputation was in the gutter everywhere else, while in Europe Sega still enjoyed a modicum of popularity. But the Saturn was still popular in Japan, so I don't think that's the case. It is true that Sega didn't want people to think this was a Sega console before they decided that they liked it. This is the only Sega console to be released in the West that wasn't originally black. Instead, it's plain white. Furthermore, Sega contemplated not putting their name on the console at all, ultimately relenting, but it's not as bold as the other Sega consoles. The startup screen just says Dreamcast, and boxes the system came in all over the world promote Dreamcast over Sega. One downside to white games consoles is that they can yellow over time due to sunlight, and as you can see, mine has been unfortunate enough to suffer that fate. But don't worry, you can restore them if you happen to have hydrogen peroxide, UV lights, and know how to carefully disassemble and reassemble your Dreamcasting controller without damaging it. Speaking of the controller, it laid out the template for modern gaming controllers with its button placement, trigger buttons for shooters, and XYAB button layout. Where have you seen that before? Either way, the most glaring aspect of the controller is a big hole in the middle. What's it for? It kinda looks a bit empty. Ah, there you go. This is a visual memory unit, or VMU. It functions as a memory card, being able to store a whopping 128 kilobytes of memory. Yeah, all that on one card. Technology, eh? But the VMU had several more interesting secondary functions that we'll get to later as they come up, that help set it apart from your standard memory cards. The controller also had a second slot behind that for inserting a rumble pack or a microphone, which was needed for certain games. The name itself was one of over 5,000 different public entries submitted for a contest by Sega to name their new system. Dreamcast is a portmanteau of Dream and Broadcast. It's definitely more laid back than more assertive names like Master System or Mega Drive. Broadcast could refer to the system's internet capabilities, or maybe that the system was so good it could replace TV. Dream, on the other hand, is more open-ended. It could possibly refer to video games as dreams, and as such Dreamcast is a place to broadcast dreams. Or perhaps it refers to Sega dreaming of the Dreamcast success, and of better days. Whatever the case, there wasn't long left before the launch of the Dreamcast in Japan at that point, but Sega weren't too concerned about that. As far as Sega were concerned, the Saturn had focused too much on Japan, and as such the Dreamcast would target North American and European gamers, but mainly North American. On November 27th, 1998, the Dreamcast launched in Japan, but it wasn't the rip-roaring success that Sega had anticipated. The decision to partner with NEC was already proving to be a bad one, as a shortage in Power VR2 chips meant that Sega were only able to supply about 150,000 of the 500,000 units they had initially promised. About 80,000 of these units were reserved for pre-order, so 5,000 retailers across Japan were given 70,000 Dreamcasts between them, and sold them all out on day one. A small success no doubt, but Sega had anticipated that they would be able to sell 300,000 on day one had there not been any shortages. To add insult to injury, hotly anticipated titles such as Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally Championship 2 were delayed, meaning only 4 games were available on launch, and of those 4, only Virtua Fighter 3 was received well both critically and commercially. Over the launch period as a whole, about 140,000 Dreamcasts were sold, a far cry from what had been anticipated. By March 1999, Sega aimed to have sold 1 million units in Japan, but it only sold about 900,000, owing to constant game delays. That being said, it was a good financial success for Sega, and the bundled Dream Passport, which allowed users to go online and browse the web, was a big hit. Good was not good enough though. Despite the genuine innovation that a built-in modem brought with it, there weren't any games yet that took significant advantage of the online capabilities of the Dreamcast. The system would reach 1 million units sold in May of that year. As mentioned before, the Saturn was a success in Japan, so perhaps this contributed to the underwhelming launch of the Dreamcast. But Japan wasn't the priority this time around. It would receive many of the releases first and many exclusive releases, but it wasn't for the reasons you might think. By May 1999, all eyes were on the impending North American release. 19999 for 199. This was the slogan that Sega used for the launch of the Dreamcast. September 9th, 1999 for 199, the Dreamcast. They had been using a marketing campaign in the months leading up to the Dreamcast launch known as It's Thinking, which was a bit experimental and didn't really work out that well since not many people knew what it was. The avant-garde approach didn't work, but the hype for the system was still nevertheless high in North America. Pre-orders were estimated to be around 250,000 units, making it at the time the most pre-ordered console in US history. There was a reason that Sega had held off launching the Dreamcast in the US at the same time as in Japan: to learn. Mistakes in the East were not made in the West. But would it work? As the launch of the Dreamcast finally arrived, everyone was wondering if Sega would finally be able to get it right.
Okay. Day after day, you're a life wreck. The powers that be just bring down your neck. You get no respect, you get no relief. You gotta speak up and yell out your creed. So back up the rules, back up the job, 'cause I'm sick of not living to stay alive. Leave me alone, I feel alive. I don't wanna be controlled. It's all I want. It's all I want. It's all I want. It's all I want.
Yes, they did. The launch lineup ditched most of the poor quality games that had been released in Japan and delivered 18 titles, among them some of the best games released for the system. Those 2 games I mentioned earlier, Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally 2, had been refined in the time taken during the Japanese delays, were now fully refined games that would play a huge part in showing off the Dreamcast capabilities. Sonic Adventure in particular was a system seller, being the best selling game for its system. It's also true that a reason for the Saturn's failure was the lack of a Sonic game for the system, and while Mario had made the jump to 3D in 1996 and Sony had managed to win over people with Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, people had still yet to see Sonic in 3D for the first time, and this was a pretty good game for the time. Nowadays the flaws are a little more obvious, but it's still enjoyable and it served as a tech demo for some of the Dreamcast's more unusual features. Sonic Adventure had a feature called the Chow Garden, where you could raise these little creatures called chows and have them participate in races, among other activities. By using the VMU, you could take a chow from the game with you and raise it to improve its stats. A neat little feature. Another game that took advantage of the VMU was NFL Blitz 2000, an arcade-style game from Midway. Rather than being a serious NFL game, this was a very wacky game designed with parties of 4 in mind, where the rules are very few and far between. The VMU's use here was that you could use it to call plays without your opponent knowing. But Sega was in dire need of a more serious sports game to keep its core audience. EA wasn't going to fix that problem for them, so Sega went with the old adage that if you want something done right, you do it yourself. The sports games coming out were all going to be for the year 2000, but that wasn't cool enough. If you were cool, you would say 2K, as in Y2K, or 2K Games. Yes, this is where they got their start. NFL 2K was launched with the Dreamcast, and the consensus was that it was better than Madden. The franchise they're most known for today, NBA 2K, wasn't released until November that year, so it wasn't a launch title. Much like NFL Blitz 2000, you could use the VMU on the Dreamcast controller to call plays in NFL 2K without your opponent knowing. Midway also released Ready to Rumble Boxing 2, another arcade game which was a cartoony take on a real-world sport. But for party games and fighting games, the Dreamcast offered more than that on launch day. While third-party support was fleeting, not everybody had seen it fit to abandon the Dreamcast just yet. Capcom was by far the biggest third-party developer to support the Dreamcast, and their launch-exclusive Power Stone was a sign of things to come. For 4-player co-op, it offered some of the best fun available on any system at the time. But the best Dreamcast game that was on offer at launch was none of those games. Yet again, it was an arcade port, but it was one hell of a port. A bit of background first. Sega's arcade machine boards from the Model 2 to the Naomi, which were responsible for Sega's 3D arcade games at the time, were deemed so advanced that not even PCs could emulate them. It's pretty ridiculous to think that arcades were the cutting edge of gaming technology back then, but that's the way it was. When games like Daytona and House of the Dead were ported to the Saturn, the difference in quality was obvious. But look at House of the Dead 2, a launch title for Dreamcast. The difference is night and day. I understand that looking back at the Dreamcast graphics today, they don't look like much, but when you compare them to the technology at the time, the differences are far more noticeable. But the game this made possible on the Dreamcast was a magnum opus on the Dreamcast for many people, and it was Soul Calibur. A 3D fighting game that looked exactly like the arcades. Critics and consumers alike ate it up. With a Metacritic rating of 98 out of 100, the Dreamcast port of Soul Calibur is not only the highest rated Dreamcast game of all time, but one of the highest rated games of all time, period. Even today, this game holds up as being fun for both beginners and experienced players. All this combined to make the North American launch a roaring success. 15,000 retailers took part in the launch, with 400 hosting Dreamcast launch parties. Sega had set their target for 1.5 million Dreamcasts to be sold by March 2000. They met their target 2 months early. In 4 days, the Dreamcast sold 400,000 units. In all 705 Toys R Us's around the country, the Dreamcast sold out.
Better graphics means it's more realistic.
And in battle, Sega's new Dreamcast video game console is graphically better.
To quote all the media today, saying this is by far the best sports simulator ever brought to gaming.
I think it's a great system. I think there's a very unique opportunity for Sega right now to come back.
Europe's launch was successful as well. In London there were plenty of bells and whistles to accompany the launch, with boxers Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn playing Ready to Rumble Boxing at the Oxford Street Virgin store, renamed the Sega store for the day. Demand was incredibly high, so much to the point where a 16-year-old girl was arrested for stabbing a man over a disputed Dreamcast in Croydon. So it seemed like Sega were back on top in the world of gaming, and for a few glorious weeks in late 1999, that was true. But as we say in Irish, too smart Latin Hibber. The launch was a smashing success for Sega, but they would have to carry the momentum forward for the system to be a financial success. For the console to be profitable in North America, Sega of America estimated it would need to sell 5 million consoles, give or take a couple of 100,000. This is a lower than usual figure for a console, and part of that reason is the Dreamcast software to hardware ratio. For every Dreamcast sold, it's estimated that 8 games were sold for it. An 8-to-1 ratio is astonishingly high.
For comparison, the PS4 has maintained a steady 2:1 ratio throughout its lifespan. What was the reason for this? Well, it's debatable. One fairly substantial claim is that the Dreamcast base was majority hardcore gamers who were willing to spend far more money than the average consumer. But even the most dedicated fans won't just throw cash at a lame duck of a console. A console is only as good as the games that come out for it, so Sega would have to follow up its stellar launch lineup with some home runs in order to maintain this impressive ratio. Fortunately, they did. It seems fairly obvious, but this is one of the reasons I love the Dreamcast. The overall quality of the library meant that the system didn't suffer too much from the usual heaps of shovelware that plagued the PS1 in particular. The games that were good for the Dreamcast were usually very good, and there were many of them. I could spend hours talking about every single good game released for the Dreamcast, but then this video would be too big to fit on my PC, and besides, I want to do individual videos talking about a lot of these games in more detail, so best to keep low here. As mentioned, launch games like Sonic Adventure, Power Stone, Soul Calibur and NFL 2K sold many a Dreamcast initially, but games would have to come thick and fast to keep up with the competition. The first year will be vital to the success of the Dreamcast.
Me again. I just want to say going forward that because Sega really gave a lot of energy to their North American run with the Dreamcast, and that's where most of the interesting stuff with the Dreamcast really takes place, we're going to be using North American release dates for a lot of these games where applicable. There will be some stuff to do with Japan and Europe as well, because still two very important markets. But we're going to be focusing on the North American market, and we're also going to be using US dollars when talking about currency. So that's all I want to say moving forward. It's just so if you're wondering why, that's the reason.
Also, 2 complaints. First of all, the Dreamcast makes a really loud beeping noise every time you turn it on, which means everyone in my house has to know I'm playing Dreamcast anytime I want to kick a game of Crazy Taxi. And secondly, the cases. Now, this is a weird complaint for several reasons. First of all, if you lived outside of Europe, then Dreamcast games came in standard jewel cases and there was no problem. But if you lived in Europe, you had to put up with these monstrosities. From a visual standpoint, they're actually very nice and they certainly look good on a shelf, but the problem is how delicate they are, especially the hinges. Opening the boxes this way means it's even easier to break them than that. So you're going to break a lot of cases, and for this reason there's a scarcity of Dreamcast cases in good condition, and because of their unique design you can't really replace them. But that's just about where my major complaints end. Now, let's talk about the games. As previously mentioned, NBA 2K just missed out on being a Dreamcast launch title, so it's a good place to pick for the first high profile release we get to talk about. Released on the 10th of November 1999, the first of 2K's basketball games blew anything EA had out of the water. NHL 2K was also a solid sports title, as was the previously mentioned NFL 2K and the Virtua Tennis franchise, but 2K's basketball game stood out as the premier sports franchise on the Dreamcast. Interestingly enough though, the Dreamcast lacked the FIFA killer, something very odd considering the Dreamcast European advertising campaign. 4 European football clubs would advertise the Dreamcast, and they weren't nobodies. All of these clubs played in their respective top flights at the time. Deportivo La Coruña in Spain, AS Saint Etienne in France, UC Sampdoria in Italy, and most iconic of all, Arsenal FC in England, where World Cup winners Robert Pires, Thierry Henry, Patrick Vieira and Emmanuel Petit would all advertise the system. Don't get me wrong, there were football games on the Dreamcast, but nothing that even came close to touching FIFA. The online service of Sega, which goes by many different names depending on where you live, lacked a game that took advantage of the online capabilities as mentioned before. However, they would eventually get the ball rolling in the West in February of 2000 with the release of Choo Choo Rocket, a puzzle game which basically served as a computerized cat and mouse game. It's surprisingly fun and comes with plenty of challenge. Thanks to SegaNet, you could play competitively or cooperatively with other players online. But what if the base game wasn't challenging enough for you? Well, you could always just make your own levels and upload them for other people to play. Not bad, eh? Furthermore, when the game launched in Europe, subscribers to Dream Arena received the game for free. Capcom followed up their stellar launch title with a run of excellent games, first porting over Resident Evil 2 to the system, and then giving it its own RE game, Code Veronica, which is still held up as one of the best games in the series to date. But it wasn't just the big guys who supported the Dreamcast. Up-and-coming developers like Rockstar Games and Ubisoft had games on the system too. Rockstar ported Grand Theft Auto 2, which to be fair was before the heyday of the franchise, but it was still a fun game that attracted volumes of controversy. Ubisoft's best release for the system was probably Rayman 2: The Great Escape.
Despite Rayman's enduring reputation even today as a 2D franchise, the Dreamcast port of Rayman's first 3D adventure was met with glowing praise. Legacy of Kain Soul Reaper was ported over by Crystal Dynamics, makers of Tomb Raider, who ported over a rather forgettable Lara Croft adventure, but Soul Reaper made up for that. However, if it were me being a Dreamcast owner at the time, I wouldn't have to wait long for my favourite game to come out for the system. On the 24th of January 2000, my favourite game for the system dropped, Crazy Taxi. A Sega arcade game, Crazy Taxi is a really simple concept. You pick up people in your taxi and drive them to their destination, and you get more points for getting them there faster. That's about it. But there is slightly more to it than that. The game encourages you to drive recklessly but without crashing, adding a chaotic element to the whole thing. The punk rock soundtrack featuring Bad Religion and The Offspring really shows the game is a relic of its time, but let me tell you, this is a damn fun relic, and the music is absolutely perfect for this game. There are plenty of real world franchises which appear in the game too, further dating it, but it's a very happy looking time capsule. This one is definitely getting its own video. Keeping the third party titles incoming was Activision, with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, widely regarded as one of the best games on the PS1. Sega weren't afraid to give more niche titles a try too, if Seaman and Typing of the Dead are anything to go by. The latter is more easily understood, being a game where you use the Dreamcast keyboard attachment to type zombies to death in the spoof of House of the Dead. Seaman is just... I don't even know. You raise the Seaman like a pet in real time and he asks you questions. Still, probably worth it. If you're looking for a more cohesive aquatic game, Echo the Dolphin Defender of the Future offers that. Tecmo released Dead or Alive 2, which was also released on another system I'm not ready to talk about yet, and the Dreamcast version looks about as good and plays every bit as well. Another solid fighting game to add to the existing library on the Dreamcast. More Capcom goodness followed with Power Stone 2, a sequel which improved upon the original in every single way. For more traditional fighting game action, Street Fighter Alpha 3 was ported, or you could go for the Street Fighter 3 games. Basically all you need to know is each game was like a patch for the last one. It seems kind of excessive, but I do love Street Fighter. However, if you're looking for the best 2D fighting game on the console, and also the best Capcom game in my opinion, that title would have to go to Marvel vs. Capcom 2. While the first Marvel vs. Capcom was also released on the Dreamcast, the sequel takes much of the spotlight when discussing the franchise in general, and rightly so. The series staple of tag team fighting is great fun with the roster available. The art style is one of the best on the system, and the combinations you can have on teams add so much replayability. The Dreamcast version currently has a 90 rating on Metacritic, and is retrospectively considered one of the best fighting games of all time. But still, on the Dreamcast that's only good enough for second place, to Soul Calibur of course, although you could probably argue that. Moving away from fighting games for the time being, Sega appealed to their traditional image of an anti-establishment on-the-edge company by releasing Jet Set Radio, or Jet Grind Radio if you're wrong. First off, the little details are nice. I love how the disc is designed like a little vinyl record. It's apt because this game has a damn good soundtrack, which I guess is fair to expect from a game with radio in the title, but still. The other thing you'll notice is the cel-shaded art style, which still holds up to this day. While some of the more polygonal 3D styles age like milk, this game has managed to hold up alright. The gameplay is fun as well. You're a graffiti artist punk rebelling against a man in the world's most militarized police forces out to take you down. The controls take a little bit of time to get used to, but once you're in the flow of things, it makes for an excellent game. With 94 on Metacritic, Jet Set Radio even proved popular with the establishment that it was appealing against. Sega had plenty of racing games too. Ferrari F355 Challenge, Test Drive Le Mans, and Metropolis Street Racer appealed to European audiences with more urban racing and decent soundtrack, while Daytona USA appealed to the NASCAR crowd in the States. It can also be used to show how far the graphics have advanced by comparing it to the Sega Saturn predecessor. All four of these games are very enjoyable, although I do have a soft spot for Daytona. Samba de Amigo was a rhythm game that used maracas as the controllers. Certainly unique on the system, although because you needed the controllers it limited the amount of people who played it, and finding a complete copy today of the game is going to cost you a pretty penny. Still, it's a fun game, and one that if you did have it, made your Dreamcast library a little more varied. Space Channel 5 was the other high profile rhythm game, which is still a solid game in its own right, but I prefer Samba. Sega would eventually get their online service on games that would show the potential of online gaming. Unreal Tournament and Quake 3 offer FPS action that can be taken online. NFL 2K1 and NBA 2K1 allow players to compete against each other, but the flagship title was Phantasy Star Online. An MMORPG, it had the legacy of Sega's long-running RPG franchise behind it and was fully deserving of the praise it received. Even today, fans keep the servers running, so if you want to get in on the fun, you're not too late, even 20 years later. The Dreamcast offered offline RPGs as well, with Grandia 2 and Skies of Arcadia. Skies of Arcadia in particular is one of my favourite games for the system. But if there was any game that would define the Dreamcast and set it apart from the competition, it was Shenmue. The game, which came on 4 discs, was the brainchild of Yu Suzuki, and at the time there was nothing like it. Shenmue is certainly deserving of its own video, but for what I can say about it now, it's a very different experience to GTA. Far from feeling like a metropolis like Los Santos or Liberty City, Yokosuka feels like a quiet small town. Each NPC has their own daily routine that adds to the character of the town as a whole. While GTA invites you to run over pedestrians, commit mass murder, and then finish it off by hiring your prostitute and then murdering her to get your money back, Shenmue invites you to respect the law, enjoy the scenery, and watch the daily lives of the people of Yokosuka. While today the game has a more mixed reception, at the time this was seen as being the pinnacle of games as an art form. I am in the camp that still enjoys this game. There's really nothing quite like it, and I'd encourage anybody to check it out for themselves. Shenmue would go on to sell 1.2 million copies, a remarkable amount no doubt, but Shenmue still lost money. To this day, Shenmue remains one of the most expensive games ever made, with a cost of between $47 and $70 million. This served as a stark reminder to Sega that they were losing money big time on the Dreamcast. Now this was part of the plan initially, but for the plan to work, time was quickly running out, and nothing ate up Sega's limited time, quite like the announcement of a new console. So I'm going to be going back to January 2000 and going over the games as they're released to show what Sega was putting out at the time to entice customers. But March 1999 had seen Sony announce the PlayStation 2, the successor to the juggernaut console that had firmly kicked the Saturn's ass. But the Dreamcast was different. While technologically it wasn't as advanced as Sony's new machine, it had things like Windows support, and unlike the Saturn, there were plenty of good games for the Dreamcast. However, this is where Sega's reputation starts to catch up with them. In the time during the disastrous Saturn years, Sony swooped in for their market share, stealing away many of the same audience that had enjoyed the Mega Drive back in the early 90s. There was some good news for Sega, as Nintendo would be late to the 6th gen party, taking until September 2001 to get the GameCube out. So for the time being, they only needed to worry about Sony. But saying that is like saying the only weapon you need to worry about is a nuclear bomb. Even the mere announcement of the console sent shockwaves through the industry. Sony had announced a few features for the PS2 that got people very excited. It would use DVDs for games, meaning more space for developers to work with, as well as the fact that it would function as a DVD player as well. Furthermore, the PS2 would be backwards compatible with all PS1 games. The hype train was at full speed heading towards the Japanese launch on March 4th, 2000. In January, Sega put out Crazy Taxi, giving a much needed boost to their system. So massive that 1 week after the release of the game, Crazy Taxi topped the sales charts of GameStop all across America. The other top 2 games that week were also Dreamcast games, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver and Zombie Revenge. In Japan, Capcom released Resident Evil Code Veronica, which quickly topped the charts in the country, selling over 370,000 copies. It ousted Sega's own Shenmue, which had been out since late 1999 in the country and had sold 400,000 copies at the time. Sega GT proved to be the Gran Turismo killer the system needed, selling over 90,000 copies in 4 days. By the end of February, 450,000 copies of Code Veronica had been sold, 10,000 more than the Oddity Seaman. When Code Veronica released a month later in North America, it quickly shot up to number 2 in the charts, behind Pokemon Snap for the N64. At the same time, John Carmack announced that the Dreamcast port of Quake 3 Arena would be coming later that year. Bizarre Creations coder Martin Chundley summed up the mood best when he said this: "Where else can you get a machine to connect you to the internet for $200 and be able to play next generation games on it both off and online? If we developers build the right online games, then the gaming public will be more than ready to jump on board. Quake 3 will be great." Advertising was everywhere. I've already talked about the European advertisements, but in addition to the commercials, some great and some not so great, the system was featured on the 2000 season opener for South Park.
Enough money to buy a Sega Dreamcast. Sega Dreamcast? All we need is teeth. I already lost all my baby teeth. Me too. You still have baby teeth, Kenny?
But all the bells and whistles in the world couldn't distract from the impending release of the PlayStation 2. In Japan, 0 hour had arrived. On February 18th, 2000, Sony began taking Japanese pre-orders for the system and sold 100,000 systems within an hour before their ordering service crashed. On March 4th, the system dropped. On March 6th, 980,000 units had been sold. Even with the hardware problems that led to Sony recalling all of its memory cards in the country, the PS2 broke 1 million sales on March 14th. 9 days later, Sony had to ask North American retailers to stop taking pre-orders as demand was becoming too great. Despite this, The Dreamcast remained in the lead with 1.9 million units sold at the end of March in Japan, while Sony sold 1.25 million PS2s by that date. But the rate of sales for both consoles meant that the Dreamcast time at the top was going to be very short-lived, and it was. On May 26, 2000, the PS2 matched the sales figures of the Dreamcast, and once it overtook them, it never looked back. Despite other releases over this period such as D2, Elemental Gimmick Gear and Rayman 2, it was going to take a hell of a game for the Dreamcast to even ride the coattails of the juggernaut. Yuji Naka, when asked about the PlayStation 2, commented that graphics aren't everything, and that it wasn't normal to spend so much money on a project to reach children. While Naka might have been right, his opinion wasn't the popular one. Third-party developers were beginning to take notice of the PS2, with Alan Patmore of Surreal succinctly analysing the situation. Dreamcast will stick around until PS2 really hits the mark. I think it'll be the interim system. It's pretty hot right now. That was the feeling around the gaming industry, but that didn't mean that Sega was out of the race just yet. The Japanese market, while ailing, was not dead yet, and the western markets of Europe and especially North America were still without Sony's shiny new console. But Sega needed to make the Dreamcast work, and fast. On what was called make or break date, June 1st, Sega should have recouped its initial investment into the Dreamcast, with about 20% of the market locked up. Sega only had 14%, and that didn't look much like improving. The only Dreamcast game to feature in the top 10 in terms of sales anywhere in the world was the Dreamcast port of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in the UK for some unknown reason. But the fight in Japan was quickly over after that. Sony ran roughshod over Sega's Golden Goose in the East, but as long as Sega made that 4.5 million unit target in North America, it would be okay. The PlayStation 2 was slated for release on October 26, 2000, which gave Sega time. Unfortunately, even the thought of the hypothetical existence of a PS2 in North America was enough for some gamers. They were deciding to wait for the PS2, and Dreamcast sales were tanking. The games kept coming for the Dreamcast. It wasn't like there wasn't a reason to buy the system, but people have had enough with Sega's broken promises over the years. They preferred Sony. That was when Sega really started to feel the heat. First was the Sega Online deal. If you signed up with the online service, you would be given a rebate of $50 to spend on games. But this didn't quite cut it. A summer of releases such as Jet Set Radio, Choo Choo Rocket, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 didn't help to increase sales significantly. 2.5 million Dreamcasts were sold in the US by the end of March 2000, but during the summer, sales slowed to a trickle. By August, things were getting even more desperate. There were rumours that Walmart was going to stop stocking Dreamcasts to make way for PS2s unless Sega were willing to cut the price of their console, and so a price cut followed. Now the Dreamcast was $149.99, half the price of a PS2 with a proven quality library of games on top of the Sega Online deal. You can only imagine how much money Sega was hemorrhaging at this point, but they had to go for it. The launch of the PS2 was at this point 2 months away, meaning that time was almost up. The move worked though, and in conjunction with such releases as Shenmue, helped drive up Dreamcast sales by 156%. But the Dreamcast still hadn't gotten past 3 million units sold in North America. In Europe, over 1 million units have been sold, but the announcement of the PS2 and now the impending release had all but crushed the hopes of Sega in the continent. Meanwhile in Japan, 2.1 million units had been sold, but the PS2 had already eclipsed that landmark. The other area where the Dreamcast did surprisingly well was Taiwan. 400,000 units had been sold here by this point, but it wasn't a major market. So we can estimate that the Dreamcast has sold around 6 million units worldwide, but for now, all that matters was North America. Sega had all but surrendered every other market to Sony. As launch day neared, Sega's fate was out of its own hands. They needed a miracle. And a miracle was what they got. Due to a supply and logistics problem, Sony were going to be short on PS2s. Very short. Of the 1 million PS2s Sony had promised to ship to the US for launch date, only 500,000 were actually supplied. All of a sudden, the Dreamcast had a lifeline. It was time to beef up production, beef up advertising, and wait for what was dubbed the PlayStation 2 effect. Another thing to consider that isn't talked about a lot is how awful the PS2's launch lineup was. Given what we know about the PS2 now, it's fair to think that the console would have had a solid launch lineup, but it really struggled in that regard. This problem was further exacerbated by the fact that resellers on sites like eBay were buying up PS2s and reselling them for upwards of $800. It's a good thing that doesn't happen anymore. But the fact that 500,000 people were going to be without a games console for Christmas, and those that did have one were finding that they weren't spoiled for choice as far as games went, that's a horrendous blunder for a company to make. It would have torpedoed the hopes of pretty much any other console then and there. and Sega were getting quality releases in at this time as well, with Skies of Arcadia, Cannon Spike, Quake 3, Grandia 2 and most notably Shenmue releasing between October and Christmas. Sega even went as far to say that if you signed up for SegaNet, you could get a Dreamcast for free. And yet, the avalanche of sales never came. Sega sold just under 500,000 units over the 2000 holiday season. People spoke with their wallets and said, "I'd rather have nothing for Christmas than a Sega Dreamcast." And well, isn't that just sad? January 2001 was a post-mortem for Sega of America. They had tried and they had failed. Now, insolvency was an inevitability as opposed to a potential threat. Offers had already come in from Nintendo and Microsoft to buy the company, with the former especially rubbing salt in the wounds. The mere thought of two giant rivals merging together, like if Man United and Man City agreed to merge. That was, until Isao Okawa forgave Sega's $500 million debt, which they owed to him. In addition, he returned all of his Sega and CSK stock, worth $695 million. This enormous generosity saved Sega as a company, and allowed them to switch to being a third-party developer, much like they had intended to before the Dreamcast launch. On March 16, 2001, Isao Okawa passed away at Tokyo University Hospital owing to heart failure. 15 days later, the Dreamcast was officially discontinued. A few good games were put out after the Dreamcast was discontinued. Sonic Adventure 2, Crazy Taxi 2, Bomberman Online, Rez, and a few Japan exclusive releases. On the 23rd of November 2001, Shenmue 2 released in Europe. Due to the financial state of Sega at the time and the lack of interest in the Dreamcast, it would never see a Dreamcast release in North America. I feel an attachment to this game in particular because it is, to the day, as old as I am. You could argue that it isn't the last game ever released for the Dreamcast, which is true, but it was the last major release. That for me is kind of poetic. It's a console that I barely missed. So why did the Dreamcast fail? Normally when a console fails, it's for a number of reasons. Poor hardware, lack of good games, it's too expensive, not marketed well. The Dreamcast defied all of those, and yet it still failed. Some point to the Japan-focused approach of Sega. Even with what I'd said earlier, there were more than a few Japan-exclusive Dreamcast games, some of which would have been worth releasing here, others that just weren't worth the effort. Others point to the divided opinion of Sega executives, with many feeling that the Saturn should have been Sega's last console. Some pointed to the fact that Dreamcast games were easy to pirate. Some suggest that Sega were too ahead of their time, that gamers weren't ready for the possibilities opened up by online gaming. But I think the most plausible reason, and the general consensus, is that Sega's reputation was too far gone. Sega was the boy who cried wolf. Failed system after failed system, consumers lost interest and faith in the Sega brand. Had circumstances been different, perhaps we'd still be talking about Sega consoles today, and the Dreamcast being one of their finest achievements. I'm only going to gloss over the fact that it came up against the PS2, the single greatest juggernaut the games industry has ever seen, because while it played a part certainly, this was on Sega. In a sense, you could say that the Dreamcast was destined to fail. But is that really fair if the circumstances which led to its failure were entirely out of its control? I'll let you decide that one. So why is the Dreamcast so popular in retrospect? Sure, it has great games, innovative hardware for the time, and the Sega name behind it, but that doesn't explain why it only became so widely loved after its death. The answer here is the very same with Zinedine Zidane. When you think of Zidane, some people will think of that goal against Bayer Leverkusen in the 2002 Champions League final. Some people will think of his dominant performance against Brazil in the 1998 World Cup final. But the harsh reality is that Zidane is remembered for a far more infamous incident. The most iconic image of Zinedine Zidane's long and illustrious career is of him walking past the Jules Rimet trophy at the Olympia Stadium in Berlin that he should have won. He could have and should have gone out as a national hero, but after losing the final to Italy on penalties, his career ended in disgrace. That being said, the French public held no grudge against their star man. In the immediate aftermath, 61% of respondents said they had forgiven Zidane for what he did. That figure is likely much higher today. My point is that nothing serves to heighten a legacy quite like a great tragedy. Everyone seems to agree that France should have and would have won that World Cup had Zidane been on the field, even though Zidane was sent off with only 10 minutes to go in extra time, and there was no guarantee that they would have won on penalties anyway. In a similar way, I don't think the Dreamcast would have been as talked about if it wasn't Sega's last console. It's as much part of the appeal as anything else about the system. But to say the legacy of either Sedan or the Dreamcast ended would be misleading. A company that had worked with Sega saw the potential in having a PC OS in their console, using the online play to expand gaming possibilities, and using the XYAB button layout on their controller. That company was Microsoft, and their console, the Xbox. Many call it Sega's spiritual successor in the console wars, but I personally wouldn't go that far. There's little doubt of Sega's influence on the machine though, which I guess is a nice thought. Sega themselves have gotten on just fine since the Dreamcast days. Some good years, some bad years, but they still know how to make good games. Sometimes. There are reports that Isao Okawa actually wanted Sega to stop making consoles after the Saturn, but then why did he greenlight the Dreamcast? To restore Sega's honour. Okawa didn't want Sega's last console to be remembered poorly, and he did know that Sega wouldn't be making another console after the Dreamcast. Operating under $1 billion of debt, Okawa took the plunge, perhaps knowing himself that his time on Earth was fast running out. As one of the veterans of Japan's post-war reconstruction, Okawa was more than Sega. He was recognized by the Japanese government for aiding various technological companies and received an honorary doctorate from Waseda University, where he had studied. He had been part of things much bigger than Sega, and yet he insisted on putting everything he had behind something that was, by contrast, insignificant. But to many, it was way more than that. There is always going to be a corporate element to video games. Companies are there to make money. But the balance isn't always struck, and especially nowadays, it can feel like games aren't about being creative or having fun as they once were. The Dreamcast feels like fun. Following years of corporate arrogance and mismanagement, it was nice to see a company make a console that felt like a fun group project. And I feel like Okawa might have been of the same mindset, him understanding that this would be Sega's last console and wanting to go out on top. Not everybody gets to do that, so it's a golden opportunity. The past may not have been so kind to the console, but the future will always remember the Sega Dreamcast.
But this was no ordinary night. It was the launch of a new video games console called the Dreamcast. Hundreds of people queued waiting for the shops to open. These people were amongst the first to experience the next generation of video gaming.
Better graphics means it's more realistic.
And embattled Sega's new Dreamcast video game console is graphically better.
Which, to quote all the media today, is saying this is by far the best sports simulator ever brought to game.
I think it's a great system. I think there's a very unique opportunity for Sega right now to come back much.
In the world of games, a revolution happens every couple years or so, and another one is upon us courtesy of Sega.